Okay, Senator Fawcett.
Mr. Hood, I think the UK report is very explicit on that. It highlights that a plastic-covered drone, the degree of give in the plastic has a very different impact to perhaps like the homemade one where there's exposed metal components. And so if the bird analogy with lots of soft flesh tissue around, it's going to have even more absorptive impact than the plastic. I think the UK report's actually pretty definitive on that point, that a drone with exposed metal components, even at 400 grams, is going to have a significant impact on certainly your helicopter in terms of the dynamic components, but even on your GA aircraft. Which brings me to the issues around likelihood and consequence, which underpins risk. It brings me to issues of compliance and culture, and then lastly capacity, and all of that will lead me to the question of you as one of our safety experts as to what work you are doing to contribute to a systems safety approach to this, as in a whole of government approach to this answer. So in terms of likelihood, Mr. Holman, you very dutifully gave the answers before then that a DJI can only fly to 400 feet because that's the rule, and we had an answer here that you can't fly beyond line of sight. Can I tell you the culture amongst the operators is different? Go and have a look at the DJI forum online. This is the people who fly DJIs for fun. A post earlier this year says the FAA's 400-foot rule is not a rule, it's only a guideline. And some bush lawyer has gone through and looked at all kinds of regulations going back into the dim dark history and statements in Congress, etc., and justified why people can ignore the 400-foot rule. So that's the culture. And what that says is, despite CAS's app, despite the piece of paper they put in the packet, the live culture that is dictating how many people in that 49,000 that the chair is concerned about operate these devices says that the likelihood of them being in places where they should not be is high and probably growing. It's also growing because things like the DJI off the shelf is more and more capable with every evolution. Therefore, there are more of those 49,000 who are flying more high-capacity aircraft. So putting that likelihood together with the consequence that was seen from the British report that you've very usefully highlighted again for us, what's your assessment of risk now compared to perhaps a year ago?
Thank you, Senator. This is Stuart Godley again. The British report definitely provided a lot of information to us. So 6 months ago when we were talking at the Estimates Committee, there wasn't really any that real research. There was just mathematical models and basically based on bird strikes and not much else. So it really has informed us. And what it has informed us is fairly consistent with what the models were suggesting would happen. And in particular for your airliner type aircraft, the risk of a collision is in particular the windscreen is probably limited to that cruise speed, and because at the approach and descent speeds, the bird strike certified windscreens don't seem to be compromised. And then you take into account the likelihood of that, and we are seeing 3% of our encounters are above 10,000 feet, but the majority are obviously below that. So when you put likelihood and consequence together for at least the high capacity aircraft, it's probably a fairly low risk. For general aviation, it's probably a different story. So they generally don't have bird strike certified windscreens, and as the British report showed, that there's a much greater chance of penetration of a windscreen, and also things like damaging the wings and rotors of helicopters. So in my opinion, I think the biggest risk is for general aviation aircraft.
Well, can I put to you, because your submission highlights that the percentage of incidents for rotorcraft as a percentage of hours flown show that they are actually probably in the zone of having most likelihood of an interaction. And can I also put to you that unlike a strike on the wing of a GA aircraft, which may put a dent in it, may even rupture a fuel tank in worst case, a strike on a tail rotor of a helicopter probably is going to mean the loss of that helicopter. You know, whilst the military used to train, you know, somewhat hopefully, to teach people to land a helicopter without a tail rotor functioning, the centre of gravity impacts, the rotational impacts, etc. I'd argue that the majority of your pilots would probably struggle to land a helicopter without a tail rotor, which means you've got hull loss and life loss. So the consequence is incredibly high. The consequence for your RPT aircraft, whilst it may not crash, we've already seen in Gatwick, incidentally on the 2nd of July, the same day that we had the Fokker incident in Brisbane, aircraft having to divert, hold, which means cost disruption. But other than the windscreen, you've got 2 or maybe 4 very large intakes to engines, and the cost of one of those going through an engine would be very large. So whilst we're not talking life necessarily, there is a cost and a consequence across the whole range. Coming to recognising, as you've said in your submission about your priorities and your capacity to investigate things, CASA likewise have capacity constraints. Does it not point, if we have high risk and capacity constraint within the regulator like CASA and organisations like yours, that we need a whole of government safety system approach to this, which includes the prohibition on the import of sale of devices that are capable of these kinds of operations, unless they are, as one previous witness told us, off-the-shelf, geofence to a very small bubble, 100 or 200 feet around the operator, with increases to that operational capability only allowed when they demonstrate that they have complied with a level of training. And I would argue the first level of training is a independently invigilated exam that shows they understand the safety implications of the current envelope, 3 miles or 3 kilometres around airports, 400 feet, etc., and that the geofencing is expanded to a hard limit of 400 feet and the other areas, and then a final level which is commercial, and so all your normal commercial considerations that currently exist would remove those limitations from the device. That kind of whole of government importation customs type restriction, as well as CASA as the regulator, surely, given your capacity constraints, is the sort of model we should be looking at. Have you done any work as the premier safety body to look at a systems-based safety approach involving the whole of government, as opposed to just limiting your thinking to the current aviation environment, which is yourselves, Air Services and CASA?
So, Senator, as I mentioned before, we're informers of policy, and we're working very hard on this issue to ensure that we inform those that we are required to inform. Certainly, under the CASA ATSB MOU, we're feeding the stats and our analysis of those stats to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and the Department. We're also added RPAS to our Safety Watch. We have 9 areas of focus and Safety Watch, that's called, and RPAS is certainly one of those. We certainly are gaining our own experience in relation to the operation of RPAS. For example, the grounding on our very first sortie, if you like, to use the drone for investigation on the train, heard the helicopter, let's put it on the ground. So it's kind of a learning experience for us in relation to being an operator ourselves in relation to the RPAS environment. So I think our view is that we are working very hard to ensure that we also inform the travelling public of the emerging risk. I did take out something from the previous discussion with Sydney Airport, with the Airports Association, about maybe we could do a better job actually of highlighting those maps that we put in our submissions there in terms of local councils and airports to say, well, these are the near encounters in your area, and potentially that would inform them in relation to the signs. But you know, in terms of, I know that what you're saying for the policy objective, we're informing the policy makers.
But what I'm asking is, are you looking for broader policy recommendations than perhaps you have traditionally taken? Because you know as well as the rest of us that ministers tend to respond to recommendations of departments if they go beyond recommendations of departments. So Humphrey says that would be very brave, Minister. And so if departments only come with recommendations that are constrained by their current thinking, and evidence we've heard in this inquiry to date, it seems that nearly every agency is constrained by the current construct of their role. And so CASA tells us, well, we don't control importation. You tell us you don't control regulation, and Air Services says the same. Who is doing that whole of government systems type thinking to bring a recommendation to the Minister saying there is a way we can tackle this, but it will involve cross-departmental action and policy that brings in a number of arms of government? Because I'm not hearing from any of you that anyone is doing that level. And if you, as the nation's premier safety experts, can't approach this from a broader systems perspective, saying what are all of the levers of government we can bring to bear to this, then on what basis can we expect the Minister to take action?
So I might make a couple of points, Senator. Australia does have an aviation policy group. The ATSB is not a member of the policy group because it may well be that we have to investigate policy decisions. So the Department, Defence, CASA, Air Services are all members of the aviation policy group in Australia. The other point I might add is that the ATSB is very much the canary in the mine, and let me tell you, we will sing, but we're not going to sing prematurely, and we're not going to sing without the evidence that we have to sing appropriately. In the other committee, that you may be aware of our report on the ATR aircraft, and we have formed a strong view in relation to that aircraft. We published 2 interim reports, and we've got a 3rd one coming. So we're not afraid to exercise that authority and have our say when we think it's appropriate. In this particular case, I suppose it still comes down to the fact that we don't think we have enough evidence yet in relation to the consequence.
Okay, thanks, Chair.